So before we get started, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. So your microphones will be muted at entry. If you do have any questions during the event, please just use the chat box. The session is being recorded and I will be emailing it out to all participants once available, usually about a week. If you have questions after the session, please email newengland@mhttcnetwork.org. And at the end of the month, we send out certificates of completion that you can submit to your particular board for continuing education credit. If you have any more questions about that, or if you need more information about CEs, please contact ifisher@c4innovates.com. Next slide, please. These are just some MHTTC acknowledgements. Next slide. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. That language is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, person-first and free of labels, non-judgmental and avoiding assumptions, respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. So with that, I'll hand it over to Shirley for introductions.
Great. It is such a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Yael Schombrun, who is both a colleague, or she's a colleague, a friend, and a neighborhood parent friend. Dr. Schombrun is an assistant professor at Brown University and co-host of the Psychologists Off the Clock podcast and author. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and her recent book is Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection when everything feels like too much. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to you, Dr. Schombrun.
Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to present. I'm incredibly honored and excited to be presenting to this incredible audience. So thank you all for having me and for giving me some of your valuable time, because if you are people who inhabit multiple demanding roles, then time really is of value. So I'm going to be talking today about using science-backed strategies to thrive in a life with multiple demanding roles. And I'll be sharing a science-backed toolkit to help us better manage the stress of multiple demanding roles while amplifying thriving. And most specifically, what I'll be talking about is how to use the tension between demanding roles in surprising ways that can actually help each of our roles out and help us as individuals to feel happier and be more successful in the areas of life that matter most to us. So I'll be organizing strategies as cognitive, behavioral, and emotion management strategies. And as I'll be talking about from the head, we'll be talking about clinical strategies from clinical psychology that help us to establish a helpful mindset. Then we'll turn to talking about practical strategies for behaviors. In other words, we'll be focusing on specific areas where we can change what we actually do, how we move through our lives. And I'll be focusing on how to enhance both creativity and rest, which are two really important areas for a thriving life. And then finally, we'll end with a review of strategies from the area of positive psychology to really focus on enhancing well-being, again, by taking advantage of tension between roles, between multiple demanding roles. So I want to start by giving a nod to a clinical framework to organize this discussion. This is actually a clinical framework that I basically use to organize my life. And it comes from a treatment called acceptance and commitment therapy. This is an evidence-backed therapy that has been shown to be helpful in a number of areas in mental health, but it's also been shown to be helpful in parenting and in work life. Fundamentally, and you'll see this in the center of this, what they call the hexaflex, is you'll see this term called psychological flexibility, and it sits in contrast to psychological inflexibility. So acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, the fundamental thing that we're always working on as therapists is trying to help individuals to increase their psychological flexibility. And we define psychological flexibility as the ability to persist, to keep going, or to desist, to stop doing in a behavior, given your values, what's important to you, and given what's going on inside or around you. So acceptance and commitment therapy is a very context dependent or considerate treatment, which really takes into account, what's the world that you're living in, what are your constraints, as well as what's important to you. And so there's 6 core processes that embody what are the skills that we're building to become more psychologically flexible. And you'll hear me kind of refer to these processes as I move through the talk. So I'll just kind of name them, and I'm happy to go into more detail about them at the end. Again, as was mentioned earlier, you guys can put questions or comments or requests to go into more detail into the chat, and I'm happy to do that. But the 6 core processes, going counterclockwise, starting from the top, are remaining present. So kind of mindful in the present moment versus being focused on the past or the future. Accepting even when uncomfortable thoughts or feelings arise versus engaging in experiential avoidance. Diffusing, so that means being able to unhook from thoughts or stories versus being totally absorbed in them. Recognizing that the self is context versus seeing the self as content. So recognizing that you have thoughts rather than you are your thoughts. Committed actions have to do with how we move through the world. So it's moving through the world versus remaining inactive or stuck. And then using your values to give you a sense of direction, to kind of represent what it is that you want to stand for and to help you decide which direction you're going to go versus not having specific directions that you are clear about. Okay, so that's kind of the framework that I use to organize my thinking about thriving in a life with multiple demanding roles. And again, you'll see those different core processes show up as we move through this. All right, so we're going to start from the head, which is, of course, where our thoughts and our beliefs live. So I want to start with this broad question of, what do you think of when you think about a life that involves straddling multiple demanding roles? And feel free to pop it into the chat, because most people have some thoughts or stories that are associated with working parenthood or multiple demanding roles. And I'm going to be silent for a moment. I won't wait too long. But I think it's kind of fun for people to kind of do this free association of what comes up. Always letting someone down, multitasking, being pulled in multiple directions, not being able to do, so sort of like falling short, not having enough time, carrying stress from roles into each other. Yeah. Time demands, scatterbrained. Oh my gosh, I feel this today. Yes. Running on empty. Yeah. Feeling depleted. Decision fatigue, right? What do I do now? And how about now? And how about now? What needs to get done, and feeling and recognizing that you can't do more. Octopus. So like hands and arms in all different directions, burnout, guilt, fear of missing out in personal life, 100%. Tired, exhausted. Yeah, and I'll add some ones that that come up in interviews and that I've certainly had, but conflict, impossible, unfair, intolerable, failure, inadequacy, exhausting, untenable, on fire, that's a good one, exhausted, yeah. So this is sort of the picture, the image that I think often can represent this tug of war between roles, right? This is kind of what we think of. We're running on empty, we're fighting this unwinnable battle, there's not enough. And that makes perfect sense, because what we know is that work-family conflict is real. It's real, and it's a public health concern, and it has real and significant consequences. In 2021, 29 million families with a child under 18 had at least one working parent. Many had 2. Work-family conflict, we know from research, can worsen well-being. It's associated with all sorts of mental health outcomes, including burnout, depression, anxiety, lower life satisfaction. It's no surprise, given that work-family conflict is also associated with unhealthy behaviors like smoking, alcohol use, poor diet, medication overuse, sedentary behavior. And of course, it's a significant source of stress and a major contributor to healthcare costs and a predictor of mortality. So it's pretty dire, and therefore makes perfect sense that we have all these negative associations. And it's not getting better. In fact, parents face an ever increasing pressure to doing more for their kids. And as remote technology in the workspace increases our availability, we find that The pressures are just never ending and we never have a break. No matter, even though we've had so much progress in gender equality, there still remains so much inequality, these unfair expectations and the penalties that mothers pay that are higher than the penalties that fathers pay when they become parents in the workplace inflexibility, inadequate social policy, even though we've been trying so hard to make progress in that front. So there's a lot of reasons that we have those negative associations with this way of being where we're occupying multiple demanding roles. And yet conflict is really just one part of the picture. It just happens to be the part of the picture that we tend to focus on, and again, for very good reasons. So what I want to sort of point to is that the way that we often think about lives with multiple demanding roles is in this fixed pie ideology. And it's this idea that our various roles compete for our resources. They compete for our time, for our attention, for our energy. And there's a reality there that is true, right? Because we only have a certain amount of hours in the day and a certain amount of energy to get through our days. And yet there's also evidence for a very different kind of ideology. And this is what researchers have called the expandable pie ideology. And this, we can think about the fixed pie ideology as representing the scarcity perspective. Again, that roles compete with each other for our finite resources. And again, there's truth to that. Then the expandable pie ideology can be thought of from an expansionist perspective. And the idea there is that there's this possibility for roles to enrich each other. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see this yin and yang symbol that I use to represent the expandable pie ideology. And I really love this representation because as you can see here, and what we know from the philosophy of yin and yang from Taoism is that what we often think about as opposing forces can actually be complementary forces, that they keep each other in balance, that the whole might be greater than the sum of its parts, and that in really unique and special ways, what we think of as opposing forces can actually be quite helpful for each other. And that idea is represented in, as you see, like the eye of each fish is represented by the opposite color. So we can sort of use what is available in the other role in the role that we're in helpful ways. And so this yin yang symbol really represents this expandable pie ideology. And what, again, I'll note is that there's truth to the fixed pie ideology, and there's also truth to the expandable pie ideology. The problem is when we only think in terms of work-family conflict or the scarcity model, we neglect to consider all the ways that roles can enrich each other. So most of the talk will focus on that part of work and family and this enrichment idea. But I just want to sort of emphasize that it's not because the fixed pie is untrue, but rather because the fuller, more comprehensive and accurate story would also include the ways that the two, our multiple roles can help each other out. So what I also want to talk about a little bit before we go on to behaviors is the importance of mindset. So how we think about our various roles really has an impact on how we show up for them. So most people have heard of mindset from Carol Dweck's research, and she focuses her research, and there's been a tremendous amount of research that's done in the learning atmosphere, so how students learn. So just as a quick, I'm sure most people in the audience are familiar with mindset, but their mindset is often categorized as fixed mindset versus growth mindset, where fixed mindset represents the belief that where you start, it represents sort of your inborn, innate, and unchanging capabilities. So for example, if you are somebody who believes you're good at math or not good at math, that you believe that that's just kind of how it is. You were born that way, and the grade that you get on a test is going to represent these sort of innate capacities. Compared to in a growth mindset, where the test that you get on a grade might represent where you are now, but isn't necessarily representative of what you're capable of. So when you have a growth mindset, you believe that with effort, interest, and the appropriate resources, you can get to a different place than where you started. Now, that doesn't undo the fact that some people might have more of an innate ability for math, but in a growth mindset, you sort of have this more expansive notion that with effort and interest, you can get to a different place than where you began. And that's an important element of why growth mindset can help you, because you tend not to give up. And so what we know from the research on mindset in working parenthood is that how we think about our roles and the tension between them has a huge impact on how we show up and on the ways that we take advantage of the gifts that the tension between them can offer. In other words, if we believe that they only conflict, we tend to overlook the ways that they can enrich. And we don't know as well to take advantage of the ways that they can enrich. And so it's important to think about the value of cultivating more of an enrichment mindset, this idea that our two roles or our multiple roles, whatever they may be, can help each other out. And what's very cool is that to change our mindset from a fixed mindset or a conflict mindset to an enrichment mindset is actually not that hard. We can do it very briefly and efficiently. And in fact, in this one study that has a great title, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Female employees with young children participated in the study and received either a scarcity or an expansion perspective on human energy prior to completing a survey. And results showed that employees appraised the task of combining their work and family roles more positively after exposure to an expansion rather than a scarcity mindset. Similarly, other research has shown that when we believe that our roles can be helpful for one another, we're much less likely to feel depressed and we're much more likely to access some of the benefits that are available. So mindsets matter even though they don't undo harsh realities. And again, they matter because they orient us in particular ways to our daily lives that can be more helpful, including, for example, in fighting for greater justice at the social policy or workplace level. If we believe that that's possible, we're more likely to continue to fight as opposed to give up because we feel like there's no point. And then mindsets can help us respond to realities that social policy isn't likely to change. For example, like when our kids get sick at the time that we have a job interview, or when our favorite client has a pressing need on the same week as our kid's first birthday. So there are certain ways that mindsets are particularly helpful. And again, going back to the original point, which is this scarcity model is also true. It doesn't undo the fact that there are competitions for our internal resources, but it can help us tolerate them more effectively. So now I'm going to move to talking a bit about the behavior. So we've got this idea of like with a mindset that appreciates that our two roles and the tension, or it can be more than two, but that multiple roles have tension between them. And that tension can be helpful in particular ways. We're going to turn to what that actually looks like. And I'm going to focus specifically on three areas. So creativity, rest, and our ability to tend to our happiness needs. So I'm going to start in the area of creativity, and I'm going to start with a story of a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Felice Dunn. So I'm going to tell a bit of a story about her because I think she is such a perfect example to show that there are multiple ways to access greater creativity. So early on in her life, actually, let me back up the story even a little bit more. So if you attended school before the 2000s, you might have learned about two different photoreceptors that make vision possible, rods and cones. So that they exist in the retina, the layer of tissue at the back of the eye, with cones being responsible for daylight vision and rods being responsible for vision in low light. And then in the 1990s, a third kind of photoreceptor was discovered. And this one was photosensitive, but didn't contribute directly to visual perception. And nobody really knew exactly what the function of these receptors were. In 2002, a team of scientists at Brown University did this groundbreaking research where they discovered that the photoreceptor's function was to signal light and to set our circadian clock. What was amazing is that that team of three had a member who was just an undergraduate at the time. And that was Felice. Felice Dunn was a member of this 3-person team, even though she was just a college student. And that her ability to participate in this kind of groundbreaking research came from her work ethic, which was intense. She's the kind of person who works 20-hour days, works weekends, does not mind working until she's about to pass out. But even more importantly, it came from her intense creativity. As a young girl, Felice loved art. And by the time she entered college, she realized that her passion was really about creativity, but it wasn't about creative production. It was about deconstructing how we see the world. And she really loved art, but she was really interested in how people get to creative insights and how they understand what's happening in the world. So she, during college, began splitting her time between a nearby art school and a visual science laboratory where this research was being conducted. And in this split, she found the perfect way to bring her creativity to life. And so using her intense work ethic and her creativity, she built this incredible research portfolio. And by the time she was in her mid-30s, she was a faculty at the University of California in San Francisco, which is one of the preeminent research institutions, and had postdocs under her, multiple NIH grants, and finally got married and was ready to start a baby, to start a family and have a baby. And she was really excited, but the transition to parenthood was really devastating for her because it shattered this world that she had so carefully built. Everything she thought she knew, her routines, her life goals, even her strengths of working hard and being intensely creative kind of fell apart at the seams. And what she told me during an interview is that I really had an identity crisis when I had him. I didn't know how to gracefully let go of who I was before becoming a parent. And yet Felice continues to be creative and continues to be prolific. So the question is, how? How does she continue to be creative, even though her time and her energy is now diverted into multiple directions? And the answer is that she takes advantage of the ways that incompatible roles help her to get fresh perspective, and the ways that her incompatible roles, the tension between them, force her to incubate on difficult problems. So let me first speak to the incompatible roles. So work and parenting, and even hobbies or other diversions outside of work or parenthood, offer this natural opportunity to kind of refresh our perspective. So you can strive to use those regular switches between your roles to see things anew, to dismantle ideas that you've long taken for granted, and to get exposed to ideas from one role that you can transplant into another. So for the book that I wrote, I got to interview lots of different people. And one great example of using different roles to get fresh new ideas was a woman who was a researcher and did marketing research. And during a regular well visit for her daughter, was talking to the pediatrician about vaccinations and how you can't necessarily force people to get vaccinations. And so it opened up this new area of marketing research that she hadn't done before. And this is just one example of many where we can use our different roles to kind of spruce things up and add new creative avenues of thought and practice to our old roles. And let me now turn to incubation. So incubation is this idea that gets represented in the Archimedes myth of Eureka. So according to legend, Archimedes cried Eureka when he had a flash of insight into the principle of buoyancy. And notably, Archimedes was taking a bath. He wasn't hard at work. But the legend, the Eureka moment might be more legend than fact, but it persists because it's this experience that many of us have had. Like, for example, if you have a fight with your partner, sometimes it's 3 hours later while you're in the shower that you finally think of the perfect response, right? Because your brain, your unconscious thought processes, your default mode network that only gets active when you're not consciously focused on thinking about a problem is where a lot of creative thinking happens. And so whether you're attempting to solve a complicated work problem or a parenting problem, or striving to remember the name of an 80s star who disappeared after the Brat Pack era, sometimes not thinking about the problem consciously is when the answer to that sticky problem sometimes appears almost as if by magic. So this is the idea that time away from our most hard-driving problems can offer us this same kind of creative power, that same kind of eureka effect. And we can allow the creativity of our unconscious minds to take over when we're not actively, consciously thinking about a problem. So for this reason, time away from each of our most demanding roles can actually spur creativity. In other words, you can use your role conflict to impose an incubation period. You can use your role conflict to activate this fresh perspective that happens because you've stopped consciously thinking about it. And what's even cooler about the science on the incubation effect is that an important condition for enhancing this effect is to do something that's conceptually different than the problem that you've been struggling with. So I'll describe a study quickly. In a study where participants were guided to work on a target problem that was either verbal or spatial, this is called the preparation time. Then they were guided to do a different activity, an incubation activity where they were told to think about something different than the initial activity that had a problem that they were working on. And researchers varied whether the incubation task was verbal or spatial. So sometimes the task was consistent with the preparation task, and sometimes it was inconsistent, a different task. And what they discovered is that incubation tasks, different from the original task, led to stronger creativity effects compared to similar incubation tasks. And so what that means in plain English is that creative advantages arise when roles are dissimilar in their mental requirements. So if you're stepping from work into a caregiving role, the requirements, the mental requirements are very different. And that's actually really good for creativity because it leaves open the kind of thinking unconsciously that you might otherwise allow your brain to engage in. In other words, having different kinds of roles that force you to step away is good for creativity for the role that you've been pressed to step away from. And we talked a bit about the core process of mindfulness from that model of acceptance and commitment therapy. And what we know from research is that mindfulness can actually amplify these creative effects. So in this study, which is titled "Who Responds Creatively to Role Conflict?" the authors define role conflict in terms that most of us can relate to, which is when individuals experience two or more sets of incompatible demands and different expectations associated with a given role. And what they found was that in conditions of role conflict, when mindfulness was high, when people were able to be more mindfully present in whatever role, whatever task that they were actually actively working on, that role conflict was associated with heightened creativity. In other words, when we are able to more fully show up to whatever it is that we're doing, we're able to be more creative. And so this sort of gives credence to the idea that the tension between roles, the pressure to step fully into a given role is really good, both for the role that you stepped out of and for the role that you've stepped into. And so using that role tension to prompt movement from one role into another has creative benefit. And this is kind of surprising because I think that often the narrative that we have about creativity is like, keep working on it, don't give up, really tap yourself out as much as you can until you arrive at a creative idea. And that can work, but this is sort of a different pathway that takes advantage of role tension that exists for people who inhabit multiple demanding roles. So now we're going to turn to think about our rest, to rethink our rest. So I have this image up here because rest is often something that we think about in sort of beachy terms, right? Sitting on the side of a beach with a pina colada in hand sounds pretty restful to me and is definitely something that I yearn for most of the year. But we can also think of rest as, coffee with a friend, whatever it is. We often think about rest as this sort of down-regulated activity. And I have to say, it used to make my blood boil as a busy working parent when people would tell me, what you need to do when I was really stressed out is unplug, take a vacation, go on a meditation retreat. Because for most people who inhabit multiple demanding roles, just unplugging, just stepping away from all of life can feel like an impossibility. And there are realities, right? There are people that are counting on us. There are jobs that don't allow us to necessarily take a break whenever we need to. There are things that we don't want to miss out on, right? Even if we're feeling kind of burned out. And so it really begs the question of how do busy people manage to take a rest? And so this is where the science of rest can really help us to think more creatively, to turn back to creativity. So one other definition of rest, other than a beach vacation or a break with a friend, is to turn off, to engage something that researchers call psychological detachment. So research out of sociologist Sabine Sonnentag's laboratory in the University of Mannheim in Germany shows how useful detachment from demanding tasks can be. And when people get away and mentally switch off from high demand work and deliberately send their attention and energy to non-work tasks, they tend to return with an ability to be more productive, to get along better with others, to focus more intently, and deal more effectively with challenges. So researchers call this switching off psychological detachment. So you don't have to go away on a vacation, but it does require you to mentally step away. And in these figures that you see from a 2010 study looking at the effects of psychological detachment, the Sonnentag research team found that psychological detachment from work during off-job time predicted lower emotional exhaustion and also attenuated the association between job demands and psychosomatic complaints, and also between job demands and decreased work engagement. But it sort of still leaves this open question of like, how do we ever detach if we are so busy, right? If I'm a parent and I also have a demanding job, what does detachment look like? Because I'm always doing something that's exhausting. And so here's where a paradigm shift is really helpful and gets articulated in this really fascinating study that was conducted way back in 1998, but which has a lot of more recent research confirming it. But I just love this study, so I'm going to go ahead and describe it. So in this paradigm shifting study, researchers showed that restorative effective role transitions can even happen when individuals leave work and go to war, which is kind of bananas if you think about it, because you're not resting when you're going to war. You're doing something incredibly stressful. So what happened in this study is researchers followed Israeli employees that were working at one company and compared employees who were Army reservists to employees who were not active Army reservists. But they matched them on things like job, age, seniority at work, marital status. And during the course of this study, reservists were called in for active duty that lasted about 2 weeks, and matched participants remained working in their normal job. And what they found was a decline in the work-related stress and work burnout for the workers who went on active Army duty, while employees who remained at the regular job experienced continued stress and work burnout. So what this tells us is that the pressure to do a given role, the pressure at work, the pressure in parenting or other forms of caregiving is helpful because it helps us to step away from our other roles. So when we are pushed, when you leave work and you go home and you pick up your kids and they're wanting your attention and you're feeling like, parenting takes a lot of work. One way to think about this transition from work to parenting is that the work of parenting is giving you a break from the work of working. In other words, stepping into one demanding role from another one gives you a respite from the role that you've stepped away from. This also provides motivation to be more mindful and present wherever you're at, knowing that wherever you're at is going to juice up your battery for whatever it is that you've stepped away from. And I think a lot of people have had this experience, but we sort of don't think about it very often or in this frame. But for example, if you're a parent who has a very young child who is very high needs because they're very young, so you have to change their diaper, you have to feed them, you have to carry them because they can't do it themselves, you have to monitor them all the time. And for a lot of parents of young kids, going to work can almost act as a break from parenting. And I know this is definitely true for me. With my third, he was a terrible sleeper. And I remember those first few months that I gave myself an extended maternity leave turned out to be extremely exhausting. And so when I finally went back to work, I was physically tired, but I was also extremely relieved to not be thinking about his sleep and not be thinking about my own fatigue, to actually really focus on something different. It was a huge reprieve. The same thing goes when you're working on a difficult project, when you have to end your workday to go pick up your kids, or if you've had a tough interpersonal day with prickly clients or colleagues. It gives you an opportunity to step away, to recharge for that kind of demanding work. And the motivation to do that more fully, to step fully into the role that you're actually in, instead of allowing guilt or technology to draw you back into the role that you've stepped away from, is quite helpful because it helps you to set clearer boundaries between what it is that you're doing and what it is that you've stepped away from, recognizing that doing so is good both for the role that you're actively engaged in, as well as for the role that you've stepped away from. So in fact, it kind of turns that guilt on its head because it helps you to recognize that you're not doing a disservice to the job or role that you've stepped away from by stepping away from it. You're actually doing it a service, both by engaging better rest through psychological detachment and by giving yourself the opportunity to engage greater creativity through incubation effects and through fresh perspectives sought from incompatible roles. Okay. So there's the summary statement that pressure between roles can help us to turn off each role in turn. All right, so again, just to make this point clear again, is that thinking about rest in new ways. So we don't have to necessarily toss out the vision of the beachside vacation, but we can engage these practices of psychological detachment in busy lives with multiple demanding roles and use that as an avenue to access rest. All right, so now we're going to turn to happiness. So this is sort of the emotional management that we can access. So we often think about lives that are overfull as being sort of on the negative side of emotions, stressed out, overwhelmed, feeling inadequate. And we're going to talk a bit about how tension between roles can actually help us to access greater happiness. So the metaphor that I think is really helpful is to think about plants. So plants need a few things, and it's pretty clear what they need. They need sunlight, water, and nutrients. And in different amounts, in different plants need sort of different conditions, but as a general rule, those are the three things that plants need. And when they don't get them, they wither. They don't thrive. When they do get them, they're much more likely to thrive. It turns out that humans are the same. Decades of research in self-determination theory have revealed that humans in general, obviously, we are all scientifically aware, and this is obviously simplistic, but there are fundamentally three kinds of experiences on a daily basis that most humans need to ensure the sort of necessary but not sufficient conditions. But these kinds of experiences really set the stage for greater well-being, and they are experiences of agency. So this sort of notion of being able to make independent choice, to choose our behaviors, to have influence over our environment. The second is experiences of competency, so the sense of mastery, of skill. And then the third is experiences of connection, either connection to yourself, to other people, or to something larger than yourself, like a mission of a company or a purpose in life. And having those experiences on a regular basis set the stage for greater well-being. And so what I like to think about in terms of well-being of individuals who inhabit multiple demanding roles is that more roles gives us an opportunity to have more places to meet each of those psychological needs. So for example, access to diverse experiences, because you have multiple roles, increases the likelihood of having autonomous choices, right? There's more places to have a sense of agency. Having more roles also presses us to build a greater number of competencies. So for example, if your child is going through a new developmental milestone and you're feeling particularly incompetent, you can turn towards your work role or your hobby to have an experience of competency. Same thing goes for connection. More interactions with more people because we have more roles gives us more opportunities to feel a sense of connection, or more opportunities to feel a sense of greater purpose and meaning. Connection to the outer world. The other fun piece of research that I think links to this and helps us to understand why multiple demanding roles gives us an avenue to access greater happiness is the research from Barbara Fredrickson, who's a really terrific positive psychology researcher. And what her research reveals is that there's this optimal ratio of positive to negative experiences. It's about 3 to 1. So that ratio of about 3 positive experiences to 1 negative experience offers this kind of gateway to flourishing. And recognizing that there's these 3 experiences that we need to have on a daily basis gives us an opportunity, the sort of recipe to ensure our well-being. So we can very deliberately and mindfully consider for ourselves, like if you're having a rough day, to reflect on, was there an experience either of agency, competency, or connectedness that didn't get met? And then to get curious about which of your multiple demanding roles you can turn to get it, kind of in the example that I just gave for, if you're feeling really disconnected and isolated at work, can you use your social connections, either with your family or with friends, to engage and have an experience of connectedness? If you're feeling like your boss is micromanaging you, can you use your hobbies to gain a sense of autonomy? if your family life is causing you to feel incompetent because your teenagers are talking back to you, can you go to work and really deliberately and mindfully engage in an activity where you feel quite skillful? And so in this way, we can use our multiple roles to deliberately access positive experiences and counterbalance the negative ones. So we're getting close to time. So I just want to sort of come back to what where I originally started, which is that there's no question that something gets lost when we wear a lot of hats. We legitimately have less time and energy to devote to any one endeavor, any one role. That is true. So that piece of the fixed pie mindset has validity. So we're not arguing with that. And at the very same time, there's this sort of opportunity to make space for a different way of thinking about lives where there are multiple demanding roles that need to be participated in, or even that you're choosing to participate in, because there are ways that being involved in many roles can serve each of those roles well. To some extent, it gives you opportunities to build more skills, to have more positive experiences. It also helps us get perspective, that when one thing isn't going well, that life is rich and diverse, and it helps us gain greater access to meaning and purpose. And these are some of the fundamental nutrients of a happy and fulfilled life. So by striving to appreciate more how the competing demands can help each of our roles, even as there is a competition for our resources, we can fuel our overarching happiness. And this is something that mindset shift enables us to do. And then by using some of the social science that reveals exactly how we can take advantage of that tension in strategic, thoughtful ways, it helps us to be active in pursuing this way of allowing our roles to help each other and to help us as individuals. So that's where I will kind of end it and open up to questions. This is a little bit of the information about me. As Shirley mentioned, I co-host a podcast called Psychologists Off the Clock, and you can find out more about my writing at my website, and I'm always happy to communicate over email and tease apart any of these ideas if people have additional questions even after the talk is over.
Great. Thank you so much, Yael. That was really, really interesting. I should mention that the Psychologists Off the Clock podcast is an excellent podcast. I listened to it myself, and I think one of your co-hosts was a graduate of our internship program. So,
oh, Jill was.
No, Deb. I think Deb.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's weird.
Yeah.
The things I don't know about the people I spent a lot of time with, huh?
Anyway, I know that there is one question. I think this came up when you were talking about taking a break, and just those micro breaks. How can you do that if the realms overlap? So, for example, I work with families with children with autism, but I also have a child with autism. So, wondering if you could address strategies in which these multiple roles could still, I guess, synergistically support one another.
Yeah. So when it comes to rest, one of the things, this may not exactly be answering the question. So let me sort of think about it with one part of my brain as I give you a little bit my stock answer, because one of the things that happens for most people, and this happened a lot during the pandemic, is that literally like the roles were like on top of each other. Like you were parenting in the same space that you were working, and you were sort of doing both at once most of the time. And to nobody's surprise, parents, working parents, and really just everybody in the world was extremely exhausted. And that makes sense, right? Because we were never getting a break from any of our most demanding roles. I felt this acutely personally. And so one of the really helpful strategies that I really take advantage of is what I call micro rituals. Not I call, but they're called micro rituals. And it's to really transition from one role to another in really small, quick ways, recognizing that you're probably going to need to switch back pretty quickly, but using micro rituals to make those transitions happen. So if you remember back in the acceptance and commitment therapy Hexaflex, we're always going for psychological flexibility, right? Which has a lot to do with role switching. And to be able to do that more efficiently and effectively is really helpful, both because it helps us rest, it helps us be more effective wherever we're at. And there is a truth that role switching takes energy, it takes effort. So it's not for free, but the more that we can engage these micro rituals, the more that we can make those transitions more fully and efficiently. So for example, my kids are often at home when I'm working during the pandemic. And so what I would do is I would get them on an assignment and I would try to sneak a half hour of work. And the way that I would do it is I would go up to my space, I would take a sip of coffee, and that was sort of like my really super fast transition ritual. I would get a half hour of work done, and then I would go back to them because they needed me. My kids were really young during the pandemic. And we can do that in various ways, very deliberately. Like when you step from your work role into your parenting role, you can activate your parenting self with a micro ritual of hugging your kids. When you get your workday started, I have a colleague who shuts her blinds when she works and raises them when the workday is done. And we can use those kinds of micro rituals to cue our body and our mind to transition into whatever role we want to be in. Now, if your roles overlap because you work with families with children who have autism and a child with autism, I think of this as like a little bit the yin yang. Like in some ways, it's really nice that they overlap because your child probably helps you in your professional life in particular ways. And your professional life probably helps you to know certain ways of helping your child to navigate challenging parts of their development as well. So you don't want to totally set the boundary, but you almost want to create a bit of a semi-permeable boundary. And so when you're feeling particularly fatigued in your parenting role, really separating from thinking about your child in very deliberate ways and kind of bringing your mind back to some of the more skill-based or academic pieces of your job can help you to take a break from the parenting role. Or if you're really fatigued from the stress of treating families with children who have autism, you can use the more compassionate, heart-centered part of yourself in your parenting role to really step away from yourself as professional. So it's sort of a both and, I think, for when our roles are really overlapping. And I know for myself, like my various professional and personal roles really feed each other, but I don't want them to be totally the same because then I won't have a break. And so you can sort of make space to allow each role to inform the other, but also be very deliberate about trying to turn off, especially the parts that are really tired and depleted when it is of service to you. And again, micro rituals are helpful for doing that and mindfully bringing your mind back to whatever the role that you're in and being really clear on psychologically detaching from the aspects of whatever the role is that are the most depleting and really need you to take a break. So hopefully that answered the question. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. We do have another, if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat feature. We have one question here. Why do you think high mindfulness decreases creativity when there is high role conflict?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the big issue is that when there's really, this is sort of, I think, embodied in the fixed by ideology, when there's really high role conflict, when things are really difficult, mindfulness is not a panacea, right? That's like asking mindfulness to cure a toxic work environment, and that isn't possible. And that's why I think these psychological tools are quite valuable, but they need to really be thought about in the context of the environment that we're existing in. We cannot expect psychological tools to make an inhumane, toxic world tolerable, and we shouldn't, right? We should use the psychological tools to help us tolerate sort of the middle zone of like real life, because real life can be challenging, and we should use them to help us know which fights are worth fighting and sustain our energy to fight those fights. But I don't think that psychological tools, mindfulness or anything else, can help us in these situations where there are intolerable circumstances. And I think that's what the high role conflict is pointing to, is that sometimes we're being asked to do things that are really impossible asks, and that we can't expect mindfulness to be the panacea.
Right. I guess building off of that question, I have my own question in that There are times when I have high role conflict where the only way I can get by is actually multitasking. And then I feel the guilt of multitasking because I know the mindfulness literature. And so is there any science out there that justifies that in some situations, multitasking is fine and allows us to get by? Or is that just being non-judgmental?
I love that question. And I mean, so when there is a high cognitive demand for a particular task, multitasking tends to be quite ineffective, because what we know about the human brain is that we're not parallel processors. Like, it takes effort to be thinking well about a particular task that requires complex thinking. And so that's why multitasking sort of, we used to think, oh, you just multitask your way through it. Now we know multitasking is getting more of the bad rap. So what I think about multitasking is that it's quite useful when you have one task that requires some cognitive thinking, and then you're doing alongside it another one that doesn't require too much thinking, because then you can be productive in two directions, but you're not going to totally drop the ball. The problem is if you're trying to and I'm totally guilty of this, even though I know the science, but if you're trying to answer an email that requires some thought while also doing your billing, you're probably going to drop a ball. You're probably not actually saving yourself any time, because it's ineffective, because they both require thought. However, if you're going to be writing an email, but also you're running the laundry, or you're listening to a important voicemail message that's pretty long, but you're loading the dishwasher, that's probably fine. So if you can find ways to stack your tasks where they're not both requiring cognitive focus, then that could be an effective way to do multitasking. But again, you want to be careful about trying to multitask when there are things that need your attention in a more complex way. But again, I fall prey to that all the time. So this is definitely a case of, do as I say, not as I do.
Well, it's very helpful. And I have plenty of examples of poor outcomes when I do that.
Yeah.
So,
it's the lesson we need to keep learning.
Exactly.
I need to keep learning for some reason.
We do have a few more minutes. Please do feel free to enter questions into the chat feature. And while we're waiting for questions, a lot of this work reminds me of some social psychology literature. And I don't know if you might do a better job of summarizing this, that they have found that when people have multiple roles, that they tend to be more fulfilled. Actually,
yeah.
There's something to that, wearing different hats.
Yeah, so this is sort of role accumulation theory. So we think about role stress theory as having more roles makes us more stressed out and makes us less happy. And then it's sort of in contrast to role accumulation theory, which suggests that the more roles we have, the more happy we are. And when you sort of put them in a statistical contest, role accumulation theory seems a little bit more true, but it's not that the role stress theory is untrue. It's just that role accumulation is a little bit more true. And I always think back to one of the earliest sociological studies was conducted by Emile Durkheim in the 1800s. He was a French sociologist who was looking at predictors of suicide and collected data from all over Europe and grouped people in various ways to look at what is the predictor of suicide. And what he found was the more role obligations people had, the less their risk of for suicide was. And I think that really gets to the heart of what psychology researchers now understand contributes to a happy life, which is a sense of meaning and purpose. So when we are obligated, right, on the one hand, we feel stressed out and we feel that pressure. On the other hand, we feel a sense of meaning and purpose, and they go kind of hand in hand. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. So it is both true that having lots of roles is demanding and stressful, and that a life with many demanding roles is a very meaningful and purposeful life. And so the question is not, how do we not have stress and not have demands? Because that might mean having not many roles and not feeling a greater sense of purpose. The question instead is figuring out, how do we find the balance of, not too many demands, but some demands, but also how do we take advantage of the demands and the tension that exists between roles in ways that serve us rather than ways that deplete us? And again, here's where the social science, I think, is really powerful in guiding us.
Right. Great. Okay, there are a couple of questions. Two questions here. One is there anything we could pass on to our employers that might help us put all this into practice? I imagine that depends on who the employers are. And another question that's similar. Thank you so much for this talk. As a working mom, I so enjoyed it. Is there a way that you think your work might influence policy to support working parents more?
Yeah, so I always am like hesitant to talk about policy because I'm such a psychologist and not a social policy person, but I do think that there is so much here that is helpful. I also think that there are people who do similar kinds of work, but that are much more knowledgeable about the social policy side. So one person is Lauren Brody Smith, who wrote The Fifth Trimester. And she's actually actively working with the Biden administration to help change social policy, because what we know is that when workplaces support working parents, that they get more out of their workers and they get more out of them for longer. So if, for example, your firm supports a leave of 6 months and then allows you to come back in a flexible way, they're more likely to retain your talent and to retain your loyalty and to retain your commitment to their mission. And so it ultimately serves them better. It seems like a loss to their bottom line to have to pay for a longer extended leave, but actually from an economic perspective, in the long run, it serves them well. And so that is sort of where the people who are more in the realm of social policy and working to enact change are helping administrators and workplaces to recognize. Another organization that's really great is called Mindful Return. The founder is Lori Mihalik-Levin, and she does a lot of work with individuals and actually has some really good resources for how to talk to your employer. And so her website is mindfulreturn.com. And I think a lot of the sort of scripts for how to talk to your employer before leave or as you're coming back from leave could be more general scripts for how to talk to people in management at a particular place of work. So mindfulreturn.com, and I think some of those scripts are available for free.
Great. And there was a question, I misunderstood the initial question. Was the name Lauren Brody Smith?
Lauren Brody Smith, yeah. And the book is
right.
her book is The Fifth Trimester, but she has a website and talks about sort of, I think through her website shares some of the work that she's doing on the policy front.
Great. Wonderful.
Before we all log off, I just a quick plug for the post-event survey that I just sent in the chat. It will also be emailed out, so make sure you fill that out, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Yael. This was such a delight.
Oh, thank you so much for attending, everyone, and I really appreciate these thoughtful questions, and thank you for honoring me with your time. Again, I recognize that time is a valuable commodity, so I really appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.